And now, turning to our program, please welcome Rob Henkin, President of the Wisconsin Policy Forum, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Darren, and thanks to all of you for being here and for giving me this opportunity to take this stage once again. Again, I'm Rob Henkin, the president of the Wisconsin Policy Forum and a very proud Rotarian. For those who do not know the forum, we are Wisconsin's leading nonpartisan public policy think tank. I say that immodestly, but the nonpartisan part certainly makes us unique. And we have been providing impartial policy research to policymakers and the public since 1913. In fact, we celebrated our 100th anniversary the same year that our Rotary Club did. So those of you who know us know that two of the major planks of our research agenda are workforce development and education. We have published several reports over the years, for example, warning of the consequences of an aging workforce and the brain drain of talent leaving our borders for other states. We have also detailed repeatedly the challenges of our K-12 education system in Milwaukee and statewide, as well as the impact of years of declining investment in our public university system. The news has not been all bad, and policymakers certainly have not ignored these issues. In fact, just last month, we published a report citing the sizable increase in high school students who are earning college credit through dual enrollment programs at colleges and at universities, and noting the promise of those programs. Still, we know that we have immense hurdles to overcome when it comes to both our labor market and our public education systems, and this afternoon we'll be focusing on a specific challenge that intersects these two areas. This morning, the forum released a report entitled Revolving Classroom Doors, which drills down into the specifics of teacher turnover in Wisconsin. That report, by the way, and some other products associated with it are all available on our website at wispolicyforum.org. Now, as Wisconsin parents and children gear up for a new school year and as districts across the state struggle with teacher shortages, this analysis provides a particularly timely look at the rate in which the state's public school teachers are turning over from year to year. Whether that turnover is driven more by movements between districts as opposed to those leaving either our state or the profession altogether, and where in the state and in what types of public school districts we are seeing the most turnover. The report was co-authored by Maria Hamadou, our 2022-23 Norman N. Gill Graduate Fellow, and our senior education researcher, Sara Shaw, who will be presenting the report this afternoon. Sara joined our staff 2 years ago from the Illinois State Board of Education, where she was a senior manager. She also directed K-12 policy for the Illinois Secretary of Education and began her career in education as a teacher right here in Milwaukee under the Teach for America program. As I'm sure all of you will agree when you hear from Sara, we are very fortunate that she has returned to our city to share her talents, and I feel confident that she is equally delighted to be living again in a community with winning major league sports teams and also real genuine Midwest affability. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sara Shaw.
I have to check and see. It's good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you all today. Thank you to the Rotary Club for the invitation and to Dr. Jackie Hard-Barber for first making this connection that this might be a topic of interest to you all. So I'm going to start us by first looking at or thinking about, and I'm going to get my timer going too so that I'm keeping track of things. Why look at teacher turnover? Why is this something worth analyzing? Because some amount of turnover in any industry is not a bad thing. In teaching, it can mean the difference between a teacher at a school where they're a good fit or where they have found their vocation and a teacher who might not be in the right place and needs to move around a little bit. So some amount of turnover, not a bad thing. What we start to get worried about is when there are elevated levels of turnover. That turnover creates instability. That turnover can mean that it's not maybe just our teachers kind of finding their way, but something more structural going on that's affecting the experiences of kids. And this was a particular concern when we started thinking about the effects of the pandemic. What was turnover going to look like in such a period of instability overall? Would we have further effects coming from the instability of teacher movement? So that was the impetus behind this report. And I'm going to show you a first slide that tells quite a story related to it. So as a primer on what you're looking at, first of all, our statewide average turnover rate across the years that we studied, which was starting the 08-09 school year through the 22-23 school year, was 11.5%. So straight off the bat, we have over a tenth of our teachers turning over from year to year on average across the state. Now that amount, you can see, goes up and down a fair amount over the years. We start in 09 and 10 with actually quite, or rather 10 and 11, with quite low rates of turnover. And some of what you're seeing here is the effects of the economy. So in 10 and 11, we've got the Great Recession still impacting a lot of people's movements. When it comes to teaching in particular, very responsive to the economy, when it is a low point, when there's a lot of other instability happening, teachers stay put. It is a very stable job. It is a steady job. It is not a high paycheck, but it is a steady paycheck. So that 10, 11 years, pretty low. 2012 comes along, and I bet a lot of people in this room knows what happened then. 2012 is where we see the effects of Act 10 start to take place. And that spike that you see there is driven by a large increase in one-time retirements or one-time jump in retirements. After that, we start leveling out a little bit, and we really wanted to look at what happens in the pandemic years. So 2021 is the first year that's affected by the pandemic, and we actually see a dip again. That dip directly related to all of that instability, as far as we can tell, around the pandemic. And at that time, there were also deep concerns about a recession. So once again, we kind of see teachers staying put, and then 2020, the effects are still going, the job market's getting better, we start ticking up, and then 2023 is actually the highest point of turnover we found over the entire span that we studied. And this point of turnover is driven by two different pieces. The 2012 spike that we saw was almost all leaves. Rob mentioned that when we talk about turnover, we're both talking about teachers moving in between districts and also teachers leaving public school classrooms altogether. That can be for any number of reasons. It can be retirements, it can be resignations, it could be going into private schools. This is just our public school teachers. It could be moving out of the classroom and working in another capacity within a school district. So you might have someone who's a teacher who then becomes a principal, or maybe is recruited to be a substitute teacher because we have a substitute teacher shortage. All of those would be counted as turnovers in these data. So that 2012 spike is retirements, largely. Also many other things, but what's really causing the spike is retirements. 2023 is actually the highest rate of moves that we see, of teachers moving from district to district. It jumps up to about 4.7% after having been 1.1% in the first year of the data. It's also the second highest number of leaves. So the highest number of leaves was 2012, second highest is 2023. That means it's a lot of instability for schools. You have teachers moving between districts, you have teachers leaving the classroom altogether. Again, some of this is related to the economy. Right now is a high level of turnover happening across industries, especially in the public sector, but really the private sector, as I imagine many of you can attest to as well, is also really feeling this. So it's not unique to education, but is certainly impacting education and in ways that bring us a lot of concern for students. Because at the time of the pandemic, when we have a lot of instability happening, further turnover engenders more instability, which means it's harder to do right by kids. So that's part of what we want to call attention to here in seeing this elevated level of turnover and what might district and state officials, in addition to all those concerned about education, want to be doing to shore up the profession and shore up our supports for kids. The other point I want to make about this particular graph before we start drilling into what's underneath the statewide data is that in these leaves versus moves, so moves are between districts, leaves are leaving the classroom altogether. In every single year that we studied, it's more teachers leaving than it is moving. So when we talk about the state's turnover issue, there is a certain amount that's about teachers moving from district to district. But the larger issue is teachers leaving the classroom altogether. That happens a lot of times in our youngest teachers, our most inexperienced teachers. I was one of them. I left after 3 years in the classroom. And then also our aging baby boomers who are taking well-deserved retirements. So those two sides of the spectrum are where a lot of these leaves are happening. We started drilling down to look at where and with whom are these turnovers happening. And the first cut I want us to take a look at is our teachers of color as compared to our white teachers. So White teachers make up the vast majority of our teaching workforce here in Wisconsin, over 95%. Of our teachers who are teachers of color, we're seeing much higher rates. And you can see that average line going across, and every single line is above that except for our white teachers and our Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander teachers, who are just about 30 teachers in the state per year, so very small sample size. It's our Black teachers in particular that see the highest rates of turnover. Now, that's quite marked. I will give it a little bit of a caveat, which is that our teachers who are Black are also concentrated in districts that have overall higher levels of turnover for all of their teachers, regardless of race and ethnicity. So it's both a real thing to pay attention to, and trying to drill down into the why there gets a little more complicated. We're concerned about seeing higher turnover among teachers of color because, as previous forum research has shown, it's teachers of color who can make the biggest difference in many cases for students of color. And indeed, in all cases, we see generally all students benefiting from having teachers of color and having more diversity amongst their teachers. So this was a first finding of ours that we wanted to pay real attention to, is that we want more teachers of color in our teaching workforce. Well, we have to battle the fact that they're actually turning over at higher levels than the rest of our workforce. So that was kind of finding number one when we started to drill down. We also wanted to look at where is the turnover happening in terms of types of districts. Now, teacher turnover is a fairly widespread issue. We didn't have a single district type that we examined that had turnover of less than 10%. So almost every district that you're talking to in the state is experiencing this to some extent. And that means when we start thinking about solutions, there are strategies we can be considering that might be applicable to all districts. But there are also meaningful differences in where this turnover is hitting hardest. So the graph on the left is showing you the differences for our districts that are serving a majority of students of color and a majority of students who are from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. That difference there is about 2 percentage points between them and their peers. Not huge, but meaningful, especially again when we consider where is this instability going to be felt the most and what impact does that have on students based on their own backgrounds. We also saw that this turnover was happening most at districts with the fewest students and our rural districts. And there's a lot of overlap there. So actually the cut that kind of saw the highest level of turnovers were our smallest rural districts by a fair amount. That was looking at 14%. Even this year is just 13%. So part of this is starting to think about the stories that we tell about where turnover is happening. Here in Milwaukee, it often comes about if we're thinking of the city districts as where the most turnover might happen. And the city districts were, in fact, a little bit above average, but it was these small rural districts that were really feeling it the most. The other aspect of all 5 types of districts listed here are districts with the fewest students, are rural districts, city districts, and then districts serving majority students of color and students from low-income backgrounds, is that these were also all donor districts. So there's a stereotype sometimes that gets passed around of talking about which districts in the state kind of train up teachers and then they move and go elsewhere and to teach. And so we wanted to examine who were these types of districts. Was this stereotype true? We termed them donor districts and recipient districts. A donor district is giving away. Teachers are moving from that district to another district to teach. Recipient districts are the ones that are receiving those districts more. So it's about the ratio of how many moves out versus how many moves in. And the same 5 types of districts that saw greater overall turnover, moves plus leaves, also were these donor districts. So they're kind of getting hit twice. They're both higher turnover, and they're seeing more teachers leave than are coming into their district. Not a great feeling of kind of having that to battle against that on multiple fronts. Thinking about those moves in and moves out, getting a little more into our move and leave trends. This shows, again, those leave trends are always higher than the move trends, no matter what type of district we're looking at. So in the cut you see on the left, looking at our different locales, we had cities, suburban, town, and rural schools and districts. This is according to a national categorization. And in every single case, we've got higher leave rates, those gray bars, than we do move rates, which are the blue bars. But you'll notice that not every district is experiencing it in the same way. Our city districts really, really grapple with leaves. That 9.6% is quite high, but they don't have to worry about moves as much. So a city district thinking about where do we need to focus our strategies is less interested, or should be less interested, in losing their teachers to other districts. They should be most worried about retaining their teachers in the profession at all. And we can think about what are the the prompts that might cause a teacher to want to leave the profession altogether or to want to leave the public schools altogether. Because again, they might be going to the private schools, they might be going out of state, they might be going into another profession, they might be retiring, or they might be staying in the district but in a different capacity. So city districts really concerned about that leave rate. It may also have to do with the fact that in the city, there might be more other types of jobs available where it's easier to move in and out of a district. It's our rural schools that have to really worry about their move rate. Now, rural schools still have a higher leave rate than they do move rate. So again, leaves are always the higher concern. But rural districts are at most risk of losing the teachers that they do have to other districts. Different type of problem, same fundamental issue. In addition to our rural schools that are our rural districts that are dealing with these high move rates, very similar for our districts with the fewest students. Again, we remember the overlap between those two. And along with our city districts, the other types of districts that had the highest leave rates, again, there's some overlap between these categories. Our districts that are serving majority low-income students and majority students from low-income households. So I said that city move rates are low. They are, but everyone always wants to know where teachers are going when they are going. So this is showing you the 10 largest districts in the state and when their teachers move, which is, I'm going to just keep saying this because it's such an ingrained kind of, we want to talk about where city district teachers are moving to, when it happens, which is not often, where they're headed. And altogether, they're generally going toward the suburbs. So that's the light blue, kind of in the middle of the graph. This is probably not a surprise to many of you, and for a couple of the reasons. The first is there is a perception around the desirability of suburban districts that seems to be in play. Also, what seems to be in play is just geographic proximity, that if a teacher wants to stay living around the same place but move where they're teaching, if they're in a city district, the closest is likely going to be a suburb. So there's some amount of just geographic convenience here, in addition to any perceptions that might exist about, for example, the ease of teaching in one district versus another. The other piece here, and this is where I'm going to start moving us out of the statewide picture into the Milwaukee specific picture, is that you'll see there's a lot more green on that top bar for Milwaukee than there is for any of the other districts listed here. And that green is our independent charter schools. So Milwaukee is, of its 2% or so of teachers every year who are leaving for other districts, a little over half are going to the suburbs, but then this 15.5% are headed to independent charter schools. Now, I'll clarify that's not our MPS authorized charter schools. So there are charter schools that are authorized by the district. They are included in the district's numbers here. And then there's the independent charter schools that are authorized by some other agency. So Milwaukee is seeing 15.5% of their teachers leave. Milwaukee is seeing of its teachers that leave the district, they're going to the independent charter schools. That might create a narrative immediately of the charters are taking a lot of MPS's teachers. What we see in fact, though, is that the independent charters are also losing the same number of teachers to Milwaukee. So it's real back and forth. Over the period that we examined, I think it was 195 teachers left from MPS to go to the independent charters, and then 197 teachers left the independent charters to come to MPS. So it's not a unidirectional movement. It's real back and forth, and that goes along with what we're seeing of geographic proximity. A teacher living in Milwaukee can move in between sectors very easily because they're in the place where there are a lot of charter schools, and in fact where there are also a lot of private schools. So we don't have the private school data, but one can imagine that there might be similar movement happening there as well. When we talk about Milwaukee as a whole, we saw that the city districts overall see a higher leave rate. That is absolutely true for MPS, and in fact is even more so because MPS's move rate is actually lower than the statewide average. Again, this was a surprise for us. There's such a dialogue about MPS losing teachers. We really expected to see much more movement between districts of teachers leaving MPS to go teach elsewhere. That's not what we see. MPS's average is a 2.0% move rate over the years that we studied. That's below the statewide average, but their leave rate is much higher than the statewide average. So a leave rate of 13.4%. You'll recall that that's higher than the statewide average for all turnover. That means that overall, their turnover rate is higher. We dug a little bit into the districts to which MPS does lose most of its teachers and looked at how much they pay, trying to get a sense of MPS is a district that has some structural financial challenges that can yield kind of compensation that needs to be adjusted sometimes, and we wanted to see whether pay at the districts to which MPS was losing teachers was lower than what MPS was able to offer. At least in the last 2 years, that's not the case. Of the 13 districts to which MPS loses the most teachers, all but one of them in 2022 were paying less than what MPS offered on average. Averages can sometimes hide details, but on average. And then in 2023, after MPS had implemented a pay raise for all teachers, they were the highest among those 14 districts that we looked at. So pay doesn't seem to be a huge motivator in the moves. And we hope that that is helpful to MPS in trying to think about, well, then what are those motivators behind those moves? That doesn't mean that pay isn't still important, particularly when we see that it's the leave rate that MPS really needs to worry about. What is it that is causing teachers to leave the district, retire, move into administration? Pay might be one of the factors there, in addition to any number of other possible factors. And the district has let us know that they are working on looking at their exit survey data to try to better understand where are these teachers going. When we think about what can we do, this can feel like a lot of bad news around the spike in 2023. Some of it, hopefully, the economy will take care of. That as things settle down, we see less instability, and we see things kind of teachers once again saying, all right, I'm going to stay put. But there are things that we can be doing. The first is to really focus on not just recruitment, but also retention. If we are bringing more and more teachers into the workforce, which we do need to do, we do need more teachers coming into the workforce, but it doesn't do anyone any good if they come in and then all of a sudden they're leaving right as soon as they come in the door. So really honing in on retention strategies just as much as recruitment strategies is a huge part of the solution here. For the immediate term, thinking about that 2023 uptick happening as the pandemic's effects are still being felt in schools, there are some remaining federal relief funds that could be spent. We are coming up on that deadline. All funds need to be spent by September or obligated by September 30th, 2024. So that is going to be on our heels before you know it. But districts can be thinking strategically about how do I use these funds in a way that doesn't just lock me into more people that then I have to be able to sustain over and over and over and retain over and over and over, but strategies that might rely on people and might rely on partnerships or might rely on technology to be able to support students and carry them through. We also saw that while this is a widespread issue across districts, those donor-recipient dynamics can be tricky, and blanket solutions that don't take those into account can end up exacerbating them. So for example, if you have a solution that is about being able to bring more teachers into the profession without regard for where they're needed most, you could end up having the recipient districts receive most of those teachers, which is great for those districts. They also need more teachers, but is going to leave the others further behind. So thinking of solutions that can really take into account where our teachers needed most and how do we keep them there. Some of those examples where we can tailor solutions to specific need areas might be grow your own programs. So grow your own programs start with students when they are still in school, in high school typically, and say, if you want to be a teacher, we would love to have you come back and teach at this school or teach at this district. And it's a way of really cultivating local talent. It's often paired with support through college so that they have this tie back to the community, might even be attached to financial incentives of saying, we will pay for X if you dedicate Y to us. Those are seen increasing popularity. There's also some new programs coming out that give specialized support to new teachers in high-need subject areas. So as an example, the State Department of Public Instruction has identified that special education is a big area of need for the state. It has been for a long time. We don't have enough special educators. So DPI has established an induction program that is designed to bring new teachers in and support them through those very critical first years so that they feel like this is a profession that I can stay in and be supported in. A little bit outside of the box thinking has come up in places like Arizona and California, where they've noticed that teachers are getting priced out, that they're not being paid enough to be able to afford to live where they would want to work. And this is not just a suburban issue or an urban issue. When we talk to administrators here in Wisconsin, they actually raised our rural areas as a place where that teachers could benefit from more housing to be able to live. Now, that might be a little bit of a Band-Aid because if it's a pay issue, maybe it's a pay issue. But there are other ways of getting at this to try to help cultivate and retain our teachers where we need them most. I mentioned already financial incentives that can be attached to specific target areas, attached with kind of, all right, you get this if you're dedicating a certain amount of time to stay with us. And then the hope is not only does that give you that teacher for that time, but maybe they really love it and they've built a community and they've built a career that they don't want to leave. And finally, easier said than done, but improved working conditions. It often arises that when we look at surveys of teachers of why they came into the profession and why they stay, pay is usually not top of the list. It doesn't mean that it is not still important. It is important to pay people what their work is worth, and that is not something we do enough of when it comes to education. But pay alone isn't making the difference in whether teachers are staying or not overall. Working conditions where people feel like they are valued, that they have opportunities for professional development, that respect them as professionals, where they have opportunities for growth, and they have some authority over and autonomy over decision making. These are the intangibles that are hard to quantify and hard to mandate and so important for keeping our teachers and making them feel like this is a place that they can grow and stay. So that's I end with the one that I think is hardest but also most important. So those were some of the pieces that we pulled out as potential strategies for those who want to be tackling this problem and thinking about what they can be doing for the state and for any individual community that they're a part of to be thinking about. As I close, I want to just point your attention to some of the other report elements that are in what we released this morning. We have lots of maps. If you're someone who likes to look at the state as a whole or zoom in on Southeast Wisconsin, which is what we have an inside of here, you can take a look at leave rates, move rates, donor districts, recipient districts. You can look up any single district you'd like and see what their turnover rate is. And we also, for the nerds out there, have a methodology appendix that explains exactly how we defined turnover, because we found in literature when we were trying to look at who else has examined this issue, people define it differently, they pull from different data sources. We wanted to be really clear with what we were using so that anyone can look at where we got our stuff from and be able to cite it. And there at the bottom, Rob mentioned, you can find our report right on the homepage of our website, and you can also find any of our education reports under the education tab. So with that, I'm going to leave my email address up there so that anyone can contact me afterwards. And I want to repeat Rob's thanks to our graduate fellow, Maria Hamidou, who was incredible in taking this on as a graduate student and really delving into, in my experience, one of the more complex data sets that I've ever worked with, that hopefully has yielded something of a lot of use to you all, to our community, to our state. And at this time, I'm happy to take any questions.
Reminder, for any questions, please keep them concise. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. First question is there any information or data on migration outside of the state of Wisconsin? So was this data just purely within the state? So the question really is, are we losing teachers to the surrounding states? And the second question is, and you touched on it briefly, is why are people leaving the rural areas? Is it because the pay is so low that they can't afford? They're getting priced out of the market? Is that the impetus? You kind of alluded to that.
Thanks. So to the first question, the simple answer is we don't know, only because the data set we were looking at was solely related to the state of Wisconsin. The slightly longer answer is that part of what we're excited about in this report is that it's one of the few available that is able to get a really rigorous definition of turnover and talk about it. So there's been a few initial reports out of other states that we benchmarked ourselves against. And those seem to indicate that what we're seeing in Wisconsin is not unique to Wisconsin, that there was a lot less turnover in that first year of the pandemic, and then it's been creeping up. So that implies that it is less of an issue of losing teachers to other states, but I can't say here's what Illinois is doing, here's what Michigan is doing, et cetera. And I do know that all of those states are actively recruiting teachers. So there is a certain amount of, we just don't have enough teachers in the bucket altogether. And so everyone is trying to pull from everywhere. We highlight an Illinois program that's designed to try to fill vacancies. So you know that they're trying to do their best to pull, and they don't care if they're pulling from Illinois or Wisconsin or wherever. To the second question around our rural districts in particular, we didn't do a deep dive into the potential reasons, but some of the ones that came up in various literature reviews and also in speaking with a few rural administrators, this point around having some autonomy over one's own classroom came up. General job dissatisfaction, which can cover a lot of potential reasons, sometimes tied to relationships with administration or whether you feel stuck in a place. Pay seems to be a piece, or generally kind of the living conditions. And there was also some ties to potentially remote work, that it used to be in a rural community, maybe teaching was kind of the best stable job that might be available. And with the rise of remote work, there's now more competition to be able to be in a rural area and have access to other jobs.
Thank you. You started to sort of touch on what I was going to ask, and this is in regards to the overall leave rate. It strikes me that it would be impossible to design effective incentives to keep teachers in if we don't have really specific data on why they're leaving. Can you clarify whether the data doesn't exist at all, or whether the schools have done exit surveys but the data's not been yet compiled?
So the question is related to being able to make the most effective solutions if we have the best data on why teachers are leaving. That's a district by district specific question. So there are districts that do exit surveys. There are districts that don't. Even in those that do, you have some questions about whether they're getting totally honest answers, because this is a small education world. So part of what we were able to look at here was, and a district on its own isn't going to be able to see the moves versus leaves. So we suspect that there are a fair number of district administrators who thought that they were losing a lot of teachers to other districts, and maybe now will look at their own data and see potentially that actually they're losing teachers entirely, or that they might be taking teachers out of the classroom in order to assign them elsewhere in a district, and might want to be rethinking kind of how they do that. So very district dependent. Some of the themes that we were seeing in our interviews and in previous research that we've done are the aging baby boomers. And so some of this is just retirements and not having enough new teachers come into the fold. Some of it is the difficulty of the profession and those first few years just being really rough without proper support and mentorship and tools available to you. And then there's a lot of other possible factors in between, including things like politicization or just having it be a very difficult time during the pandemic, et cetera.
I'd like to know how violence impacts teachers leaving in the MPS schools.
I don't have a definitive answer for you. The question was about the impact of violence in MPS schools. I think we can generally classify that under difficult working conditions, but of course that's an understatement as to the impact that violence either in one's own classroom, in one's school, in one's district has upon not only a teacher's experience, but obviously student experience. So we didn't isolate that out. I think certainly that is part of the perception of working in MPS that the district has to battle against, and it is the individual experiences of students and teachers that kind of contributes to how much of an actual impact that has.
I'd like to thank you for your work today. I'd like to ask a little bit more about the affordability for entry-level teachers, because I heard you talk about affordable housing, and I assume that is more than just in Milwaukee where you're seeing that. You talked about some other states. Could you expound on that, please?
Yeah, so Arizona and California were the two states where we saw just snippets of starting programs around thinking about affordable housing. And these were regions where either the median home value was increasing just much more quickly than teacher pay was increasing, or cases of it could be either entry-level teachers or existing teachers, kind of people who are coming into the profession and deciding where to live, or people who have been in the profession or feel like they're being pushed out or pushed elsewhere, or as if they need to go into another profession entirely. So thinking of that as how are we welcoming teachers into a community? And if we're welcoming teachers into a community, accounting for all of their needs, and housing may be a real need there.
Hi, when I think about school districts competing for teachers and teachers moving between districts, are there structural limits to the number of teachers that we're training? In other words, limitations on educational slots in universities and colleges, et cetera?
Yeah, so the question on kind of what are our barriers to teachers entering the profession in the first place? The barrier of having enough seats in schools of education is is not one that we've seen. That schools of education that we talk to are really hungry for more teaching candidates and trying to figure out how can they recruit more. Some of our research around teachers of color has seen that there are structural barriers, particularly for teachers of color, to make it all the way through our educator preparation programs, such that they feel valued, that they feel like they belong, that they feel like that this is a profession for them, in addition to some financial barriers. So for example, if you're expected to do a semester of student teaching and that is unpaid, and you have to go either get another job or you can't afford to do the work without another job, that immediately creates a financial reason why you might not be able to enter the profession. So some of this is thinking about how do we welcome into our both traditional schools of education and also alternative preparation programs, such that we're bringing more teachers in. And then you'll hear me go back to, it's about not just recruitment, but also retention. Once we have them in school districts, how are we making those places where they feel supported and welcomed?
This is a question on retention. First of all, congratulations on a great report. You mentioned retention just in your last response, and I note that retention issues are not alone for the public sector, education sector, but the private sector as well. Your solution to retention in part was some kind of individualized incentivization, if you will, for the teacher. It might be training, it might be special assignments, et cetera, to give them psychic pay, if you will. That seems to run at odds with some of the institutionalized industrial model of education, some of the requirements, bureaucratic and statutory requirements, and in some cases, labor agreements. So could you kind of drill down a little bit on what a good retention strategy might look like?
So questions about what a good retention strategy might look like, especially in a workforce that has more competition available to it. So we saw move rates have spiked in 2023. They've been on the incline ever since, on the upswing, ever since Act 10. There does seem to have been an effect between removing some of the requirements around collective bargaining agreements and making teachers feel like they didn't have to stay in the same spot in order to enjoy all the benefits of having been there for years. So that's, depending on how you look at it, can be a plus for teachers being able to have more mobility, could be a minus of not being able to really have that institutional experience and being able to benefit from it. So at this stage, with that kind of more mobility available, thinking about working conditions, yes, on an individualized basis, but also collective, that the culture of a school is so important for the experience of the teacher there. And so there's a certain amount of being able to have every single teacher feel valued, feel like they have room to grow, feel like they are supported, but it's also about, does the school feel supported? Does the school feel like a place where staff and teachers are where staff and students are happy to be. So that's in thinking about kind of those overall working conditions. I think there's also pieces that can be tied to in a district that has more flexibility, specific financial incentives or specific kind of pay raises or incentives. But if a district doesn't have that flexibility, that's certainly not meaning that they can't do things to better retain teachers.
Over the years, MPS has employed a variety of strategies, sort of non-traditional strategies, to bring people into the teaching profession. MTech, I don't even know if it's still around, comes to mind. But there have been a variety of other kinds of things. Do you have any sense of whether the retention of the people who've come into the teaching profession through those non-traditional routes is any better or worse than the traditional, BA degree?
Sure. So question of kind of the efficacy of those alternative licensure programs. MTech is now the Urban Learning Collaborative. They are still very much in existence. I came through Teach for America, which is another one of those programs. I am the poster child for both the lack of retention in the classroom and the continued engagement with the sector. And that has often been TFA's legacy, that they do nationally, I don't know about specifically in Milwaukee, but nationally have lower retention rates than your traditional teacher, but also very high continued engagement in education. I don't know about MTech now, ULC or other programs, and we weren't able to get to that level of detail, but it's very much a good question to be asking as we're considering what are the strategies here.
You spoke of culture being a part of the decision of whether or not a teacher stays or moves. Starting in COVID, there was some political challenges in some of the school districts that hit national news. Since that was part of the survey that you were doing in time-wise, what kind of impact does the political structure of different school districts have?
Yeah, so question on how much does the politics of a community, whether that's kind of the broader community, town, or the specific school community, how might that be affecting turnover? The answer is we don't know specifically. I will say that there have been a number of national studies that have asked teachers whether they want to be staying in the profession, and that number is always lower than the number that end up staying. So it's easier for teachers to say that they are unhappy than it is for them to leave. And some of that unhappiness might indeed come from the politicization that we often see in school board meetings, in classrooms, et cetera. Whether or not that's enough to actually have a teacher leave, assuming they're not laid off in the process, that's trickier, particularly because in many of our districts, these are such stable jobs and are ones that are really a source of a lot of pride and kind of ties to the community. So I think that's a little bit, it remains to be seen how much this continues playing out as a factor in turnover. Thank you all so much. What a pleasure.